if you could talk a little bit more about the experiences of migrants with this kind of electronic surveillance and how ICE has used this kind of technology to its benefit on the border.
Sure. But just to address a minute the idea that it's better, uh, because I mean I've encountered this argument. It's better than jail. It's better than prison, and I think I mean what I always say is that I'm never going to say to someone who's sitting in a jail or prison, especially during COVID time, oh no, don't go on electronic monitor. It's really bad. Well, I know where you are is worse than that electronic monitor. But my point about that is that what we what we see as the best solution or the optimal solution for an individual isn't what we must look at when we look at the big picture. So yes, if someone wants to come out of an immigration prison and go and be with their family on electronic monitor, whatever the conditions are, maybe that's better for them as an individual. But is that what we content with that? Are we going to say this is good, this is the solution, let's move on to something else? And that's our point around electronic monitoring. We don't want electronic monitors. We want people to be given resources and access to opportunities and not be tracked, not be confined to their house, but be given a chance to connect with their families in the same way that that's not happening under ICE and home and release and so forth. What are the conditions under which people are now are subject to when they're put on these monitors or under the so-called alternatives to detention program of the Immigration and Customs Enforcement? So we're seeing right now that the Biden administration is cranking up the number of people that are going to be on surveillance. They're in the past, most people who are under ICE on electronic monitors were not actually under house arrest. They could pretty much move around in most instances, but their data was being tracked and used in many ways against them. But now they're going to start to introduce at least 12 hours a day of house arrest as they expand the use of electronic monitors. So I mean, I'm predicting that that's going to get tighter, number one. But number two, organizations like Just Futures Law, Mi Gente have done incredible research looking at the ways in which companies like Palantir, LexisNexis, and so forth have been gathering the data on electronic monitoring. And this is one of the only instances where you can actually get national data because it's under ICE, whereas with the other electronic monitors under county or state authority. So they're building all these networks of criminals and who's working and who's working without a permit, and also who's using state resources and not giving back.
Right. Right. And it's just expanding their cloud of knowledge. I want to now expand on what you talked about with Palestine, because that is just such an important point. Because yes, it's a surveillance state, but it's not bound by state borders, by national borders. These are the surveillance of Palestine makes total sense given the fact that Israel and the United States have a close relationship when it comes to sharing technology and the murderous technology that we use in the Middle East. We often share with them as well, and of course that's being used in the oppression of the Palestinian people. They're already in an open air prison. Now let's monitor them and imprison them even further.
Yes, I mean, well, I think it's interesting also that two of the biggest electronic monitoring companies in the U.S. are Israeli based. That's Atenti and Supercom. So I mean, as you pointed out, they're really at the cutting edge of the development of a lot of this surveillance technology. And in fact, the Palestinians are, really experimental subjects for a lot of this technology. And what I was really trying to point out in that chapter is the fact that people are beginning to talk about open air prisons in the United States, and the fact that a lot of, say, Black communities become like almost like an open air prison with the technologies that are used with stingrays and surveillance cameras and facial recognitions and license plate readers and extensive police occupation. And I mean, so I wanted people to connect the dots between, what happens in those communities and what's happening in a place like Palestine, but also to realize that in Palestine, there's a whole other dimension to this. And that is A, that we have actual physical walls that keep them in there, physical barriers, and B, that the population is subject to military attack and bombing by the Israeli Defense Force,
Mm,
which which isn't exactly what's happening in the U.S. But I think we just need to be aware that these things take different shape in different places, but there's still connections between the technology that's used and, most of all, the mentality of people that build systems, that build these punitive systems, which target certain populations.
right. Yeah. And I mean, I we talk about that. We've talked about this a bit on the show before. There is a lot of shadiness and lack of clarity on the extent of the United States operations in Africa, where we have a larger presence than is widely publicized. And my guess is there is, I'm sure, a lot of testing being done there in terms of surveillance technology. But now I walk myself back a little bit there too, because a lot of it's just happening here in the United States on poorer populations as well.
But I think there's an important international connection there, that the raw materials, the minerals that are used for a lot of this surveillance technology are being mined in Africa by children in some cases, by super exploited labor. So I mean, I think that's another way of connecting the dots of, even in our cell phones, we have various minerals and so forth that are coming from places like the Democratic Republic of the Congo. So we rely on exploiting that labor in order to be able to surveil countries and continents.
Yes. Well, I mean, your book is an incredible read. I would encourage everybody to check it out. James Kilgore, author of Understanding E-Carceration, Electronic Monitoring, the Surveillance State, and the Future of Mass Incarceration. Thank you so much for being here with us and bearing with us on our first day with our new streaming situation. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Emma. It's been a great conversation. I appreciate your work.
Absolutely. And you too as well.